Skill-based matchmaking, or SBMM, has been a hot topic in the gaming space for some time now, and this conversation has picked up quite a bit recently, specifically relating to Call of Duty and Halo. There are a ton of people who do not like skill-based matchmaking, although there are some that will defend it. And from what I've seen, when people talk about skill-based matchmaking, some people are referring to different things. They will call it skill-based matchmaking, but not everyone is referring to the same type of thing when they say skill-based matchmaking. There are 4 main types of skill-based matchmaking methods that I see people refer to when they talk about SBMM in video games. The first method is matching players together with a similar rank in a ranked playlist. And I think many people are familiar with this. This is pretty standard for many ranked offerings in games. In ranked playlists, players have a rank, and the game matches players together based off of that rank. Another type of skill-based matchmaking is about hidden MMR. It's the idea that players have this hidden rank that you can't see in-game, and the system will match players together based off of that hidden rank. Then we have a type of skill-based matchmaking that tries to form even teams. And that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone in that match will be a similar skill level. The game could form what it believes to be even teams by doing something like having 1 really good player on each team and 3 really bad players on each team, and the system would look at that as even teams, even though everyone in that match is not a similar skill level. And while those may be even teams, it makes for some really awkward matches. Like, for example, in some matches that have teams structured like that, it's kind of a battle of which really good player on each team can carry their team harder. Another example of skill-based matchmaking trying to form even teams for a match would be something like placing 4 average players on one team and then 3 really bad players on the other team with 1 really good player, and the system might think that those are even teams. Because yeah, there may be 3 really bad players on one team, but they also got 1 really good player, and the other team just has 4 moderately skilled players. And even though the system might feel that those are even teams, that's not always necessarily the case. Sometimes the team with the 3 really bad players and the 1 really good player will lose because the good player can't carry their team hard enough because the bad players are just so bad and they're feeding way too many kills to the other team. And again, matches like that can be very awkward because on one team you have a bunch of average players that kinda know what they're doing, and then on the other team you have a really good player that's trying his ass off to carry all of his really bad players that are just feeding kills. And the last type of skill-based matchmaking that I wanted to mention is the idea that there's a system in place that is trying to keep players at about a 50% win-loss ratio. So a system that wants players to win about half of their games and lose about half of their games. So sometimes it'll give players easier games so that they win, and then other times the system will give players harder games so that they lose, and it keeps them at about a 50% win-loss ratio. So like I said, some people are referring to different types of things when they talk about skill-based matchmaking in video games, and I think that might be where some of the confusion comes from and some of the disagreements, because a lot of people are in favor of skill-based matchmaking in ranked playlists, meaning that players are matched together who have a similar rank. A lot of people are okay with that. Plenty of the people who hate skill-based matchmaking in unranked playlists don't mind it in ranked and feel it should be in ranked. So just keep in mind that it's not like everyone hates skill-based matchmaking universally. It really just depends on which kind of skill-based matchmaking we are talking about. Now, the next thing I want to touch on is, how do we know that skill-based matchmaking is actually a real thing in games? Like, is it confirmed, or do people just feel like there's skill-based matchmaking? Well, for the most part, developers are pretty quiet on this topic. I couldn't find any instance where 343 has acknowledged the existence of skill-based matchmaking in unranked playlists in their games. And all I could find of confirmation that skill-based matchmaking exists in Call of Duty was this interview with Josh Menke, who used to work at Activision, where he talks about how Call of Duty has always had skill-based matchmaking. It's just that the math and science behind it have gotten better over the years. There was also a recent tweet from Max Hoberman, who used to work at Bungie and worked on Halo 2 and 3 back in the day. And when talking about unranked playlists, he did mention that our engineers utilized the same codebase and kept skill/level as a criteria, but we substantially deprioritized it in matchmaking. So that is some evidence that skill-based matchmaking did exist back in unranked playlists for Halo 2 and Halo 3. But like he said, it was substantially deprioritized, which allowed for a very wide range of skill levels to match together. So it doesn't seem like there's been a ton of acknowledgement from developers of skill-based matchmaking in their games. And I think the main reason people talk about skill-based matchmaking as if it is a real thing today is just from what they experience playing games and how different things are now than they used to be. Like, for example, people might remember playing Call of Duty or Halo back in the day, and when they played unranked playlists, they would match people of all kinds of different skill levels. There were plenty of matches where we would go up against really bad players. There was plenty of matches where we'd go up against good players. But nowadays, in more modern Call of Duty games, in Halo Infinite, in various games, a lot of players feel that matches have become a lot sweatier, meaning that it is a lot more common that they're getting into matches consisting of players who are of a similar skill level as themselves, and it's a lot less common that they're playing against players who aren't very good at the game. But back in the day, it was a mix of everything. There was a ton of variety in skill levels that you were getting matched up against. That is how a lot of people feel about playing multiplayer games now compared to back in the day. And they're obviously not wrong for feeling that way, and I don't doubt that that is the experience for a lot of people now. I mean, that's been my experience with games in recent years. I played a lot of Halo 3 back in the day, and I can tell you right now, from my experience, the difference of playing ranked in that game and social in that game was night and day. I can't really say that from the experience I've had in modern Call of Duty games or in Halo Infinite. Sometimes the unranked modes feel just like the ranked modes in terms of the skill levels that I'm getting matched up against. And it's a lot less common that I'm playing against players who aren't very good. So it makes sense why players would feel that there is some type of skill-based matchmaking system in place. And that could be one of the 4 skill-based matchmaking methods that I mentioned earlier, or it could be a combination of different ones, or it could be something that I didn't mention. And another reason I feel players assume that skill-based matchmaking is a real thing is due to how quiet developers are on this topic. Like, the community is very vocal when it comes to SBMM, but you barely or never see developers talking about skill-based matchmaking in their games. Recently, Sledgehammer Games, the developer of Modern Warfare 3 2023, did a Reddit Ask Me Anything, and they received a ton of questions about skill-based matchmaking, and yet Sledgehammer Games did not acknowledge skill-based matchmaking in that AMA. So developers are definitely very quiet on this topic. But regardless of whether or not we know 100% for sure if skill-based matchmaking actually exists in a particular game, regardless if we know 100% which kind of skill-based matchmaking is implemented, it absolutely does make sense why players would feel skill-based matchmaking does exist, and it makes sense why a lot of players wouldn't like it. And I've always held the opinion that ranked playlists should have skill-based matchmaking, meaning that players are matched together who have a similar rank in that playlist. No hidden MMR bullshit. No, you match based off of the rank in that ranked playlist. And then as for unranked playlists, I don't think you should have any skill-based matchmaking at all. None at all. I know a lot of people say, oh, tone it down. It shouldn't be as strict. You don't need it at all. At all in unranked playlists. First off, when it comes to a developer reducing how strict the skill-based matchmaking is, the developer could always say, oh yeah, we've reduced it, but you're still getting put into matches that are just as sweaty. Now, yeah, that same thing could apply if they said they removed skill-based matchmaking altogether. You could still find yourself being placed into sweaty matches, but I think it would be a lot more obvious if they lied about removing skill-based matchmaking than if a developer lies about toning the skill-based matchmaking down. Some people act like the only reason people don't like skill-based matchmaking is because they want to play bad players. And I've always acknowledged that I'm sure that is the case for some people, but for a lot of people, that is not the case. There's a ton of people who don't like skill-based matchmaking in unranked playlists, and it doesn't mean that they just want to play bad players. It doesn't mean that they don't like to play sweaty, competitive matches. For many people, it just means that they want ranked to be ranked, where they play other people of similar skill, and they get their sweaty matches, and they want unranked to be unranked, where they can match anyone. And there's no underlying system in place that is trying to match them up against other players of a similar skill, or trying to force a 50% win-loss ratio, or trying to balance teams in some strange ways. People don't always want to play these very competitive matches where everyone is really skilled at the game and you have to try your ass off to do well, especially when it comes to unranked playlists. A lot of people want a variety, and if that means that sometimes you only match good players, then so be it. If that means that sometimes you're just matching other bad players, then so be it. But when they feel there's a system in place that is responsible for placing them into these matches that aren't very enjoyable, I think that's what a lot of people have a problem with. And when it comes to people wanting a variety in the skill levels that they play against, like sometimes they want to play really good players, sometimes they want to play really bad players in unranked playlists, keep in mind that when you hear many people talk about wanting variety in these unranked playlists, it's not just about some players being good, some players being bad, a mix of both, because depending on the skill level of other players in your match, that can have a huge impact on how that match plays. It's not just like every match plays the same or very similar, and the only difference is some players are easier to kill than others because they're not as good. No, when you play really skilled players, the match can play out in an entirely different way than if you're playing really bad players. So that's another thing people are talking about when they say they want variety. because the skill level of the players you are being matched up against can have a huge effect on how that match plays. And when players find that all their matches are playing out in a very similar way because they're being put into sweaty matches every game, that is very frustrating for a lot of people, because they also want to be placed in some matches that are more relaxed and the players that they're up against aren't as good. And they can play that match out in a more relaxed, carefree kind of way. Like in Halo and in Call of Duty and in various other games, sometimes players want to attempt to pull off some sort of extravagant play, whether that's a trick shot in Call of Duty, or a high multi-kill in Halo, or any other type of crazy, over-the-top way of getting a kill. When you have to face better players, there's usually less opportunities to pull these types of things off. And you might not want to even attempt to pull one of these crazy plays off against better players, because that could result in you losing the game if you play that way. So you do play more reserved and you try your ass off to win the match. But like I've said, people don't want to deal with that every game. Now, assuming that skill-based matchmaking does exist in unranked playlists, with how many people hate SBMM, why does it exist? Well, I think the most common answer to that question is it probably helps with player retention. But here's the thing about that. Sure, I don't doubt that there are people out there who would quit playing a game if they're going up against players that are better than them and they're getting destroyed. But if they're getting matched against players of a similar skill and they feel like they can actually compete, they're more likely to play longer. But I also know there's some people who don't play games because they feel like they have to sweat their ass off every match. So yeah, skill-based matchmaking might result in retaining some players, but it also results in pushing other players away. And I don't have the data on this. I'm not seeing what the developers are seeing. Maybe from their data, skill-based matchmaking might keep players around longer than it does push players away. Maybe. But it is kind of silly when people cite player retention as a reason for why skill-based matchmaking may exist, because I feel like there are a lot of other more significant things that would also help with player retention. I mean, we're in a time where many games release broken or unfinished or just not as good as older games in that series. And I think it's fair to say that releasing a good game instead of a bad game, releasing a polished game instead of a broken game, releasing a finished game instead of an unfinished game, would also help with player retention. So don't give me that, it's to help player retention and more people stick around with skill-based matchmaking. Don't give me that crap in a time where games are releasing as garbage as they do. Now, yeah, you could argue that, it's easier for them to implement skill-based matchmaking than actually finishing their game and implementing all these modes that should have been there at launch, and skill-based matchmaking is just overall just an easier thing for them to do to help with player retention. But even if that's true, skill-based matchmaking is also something that a lot of people don't like. And like I mentioned, it does in fact turn some people away. How many people would it turn away if you actually release a good game, a finished game, a polished game? Skill-based matchmaking might be the easier way to retain players, but it's also something that a ton of people hate. And a reason that I think developers might be more inclined to implement skill-based matchmaking into their game nowadays, as opposed to back in the day, is due to the lack of ranked playlists in many games today. Now, even if this wasn't the case, and there were a ton of ranked playlists in the game, I'm not saying that skill-based matchmaking wouldn't be a thing, but I think developers might be more inclined to implement SBMM because of the lack of ranked playlists. And here's what I mean by that. Back in the day with something like Halo 2 or Halo 3, you had a bunch of ranked playlists and a bunch of unranked playlists. So there were plenty of options for players who wanted a more competitive experience, and there were also plenty of options for players who wanted more of a relaxed experience. Like in Halo 3, if you wanted to play Team Slayer and you wanted a more competitive experience, you could go play ranked Team Slayer. If you wanted to play Team Slayer with a more relaxed and casual experience, you could go play social Team Slayer. If you wanted to play competitive free-for-all, you can go play Lone Wolves, which was a ranked playlist. If you wanted to play a more relaxed free-for-all, you could go play Rumble Pit, which was an unranked playlist. At one point, Halo 3 had both a ranked team doubles playlist and a unranked team doubles playlist. It also even had a ranked big team battle playlist and a unranked big team battle playlist at the same time. So because of the variety of ranked playlists and unranked playlists in games like Halo 2 and Halo 3, not only could players choose which type of mode they wanted to play, but in some cases they could choose whether they wanted to play the more competitive ranked version of that mode or the more social unranked version of that mode. In a lot of games now, you don't have this same kind of variety with ranked versus unranked playlist. In many games nowadays, they launch with one ranked playlist or a few ranked playlists. And so instead of the game leaning closer to 50% unranked playlist and 50% ranked playlist, it's closer to like 90% unranked playlist and 10% ranked playlist. And again, that could mean just one ranked playlist. And so there's less opportunities for players to choose whether or not they want to play the ranked version of that mode or the unranked version of that mode. And because they don't have that choice, I think that's why developers might be more inclined to step in and implement skill-based matchmaking into these unranked playlists. And these are just my thoughts. Like, I'm not claiming that developers are absolutely considering this when it comes to skill-based matchmaking, but it does make sense. But even then, you had games back in the day that didn't have any ranked playlists, like older Call of Duty games, where players did feel that there was either no skill-based matchmaking or it was a lot less strict than it is nowadays. So anyways, if developers are concerned about people not playing their game because they're getting matched up against players who are much better than them and they can't compete, then I think a much better solution than implementing skill-based matchmaking into unranked playlists would be to give players options. Give them a bunch of ranked playlists to choose from and a bunch of unranked playlists to choose from. And the unranked playlist doesn't have to mirror the ranked playlist one-to-one. There can be some differences in terms of maps and game modes. I think that's fine. And having a ranked playlist and a unranked playlist that are both similar in what they offer, that not only gives players more of a choice in which type of experience they want to have, whether it's something more competitive or something more chill, but I think that would also help filter the really good players out of the unranked playlist and into the ranked playlist. Because a lot of people do like ranked. A lot of people do want to play those sweaty competitive matches, just not in unranked playlists. And when it comes to how many playlists a game offers, I know that population is obviously a factor. Like, obviously with a larger player base, the game can afford to have more playlists. But currently with games like the newer Call of Duties or the newest Halo game, Halo Infinite, the amount of playlists are not the issue. When it comes to playlists in those games, there are a decent amount of offerings. It's just that, like I already mentioned, there's not many ranked playlists amongst them. So anyways, those are my thoughts on skill-based matchmaking. Like I said, it should be a thing in ranked playlists, but when it comes to unranked playlists, there should be no SBMM involved in that matchmaking process. A lot of people do hate skill-based matchmaking. It definitely turns people away. And like I've mentioned, there are plenty of other more significant ways to help with player retention that don't piss as many people off as something like skill-based matchmaking, which pisses a lot of people off. Anyways, that's going to do it for this one. Hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I will see you on the next one. Peace out, everybody.